Analysis of fairy tales. I'm Anusha Tennakon. I would like to invite you all here to subscribe my channel for more videos. Content of today's presentation. Number 1. What is a fairy tale? Number 2. Types of fairy tales. Number 3. The importance of fairy tales. Number 4. Characteristics of fairy tales. Number 5. Recording of fairy tales. What is a fairy tale? I'm sure that you all are familiar with fairy tales and you all have read fairy tales. Fairy tale is a story often intended for children. So it contains fanciful and wondrous characters such as elves, goblins, wizards. It is not mandatory for fairy tales to have fairies. Remember, fairy tales are often traditional. They were passed down from storyteller to storyteller before being recorded in books. Types of fairy tales. There are no fixed rules for fairy tales. So, there are many types of fairy tales. Some of those types are based on characters of the fairy tale, such as fairy tales with supernatural enemies. Red Riding Hood can be taken as an example. Fairy tales with supernatural or enchanted relatives. Sleeping Beauty and Beauty and the Beast, they are the best example for this. Fairy tales with supernatural helpers. Cinderella, the fairy tale Cinderella is the best example for that. Next, fairy tales with magic objects. Aladdin is the best example for that. At the same time, fairy tales can be categorized according to region, such as Indian fairy tales, American fairy tales, Chinese fairy tales, European fairy tales, and so on. The importance of fairy tales. Fairy tales spark our imaginations and allow us to experience things in our world before we experience them in the real world. Through imagination, we learn about our world and we can explore outcomes and possibilities. Now let's pay our attention to characteristics of fairy tales. Number 1. Fairy tales are short stories. Fairy tales are not very long. In the past, people used to tell them loudly and listen to them. Most fairy tales are easily told within 15 minutes. There's a limit to how long people can listen to a story. Number 2. Fairy tales contain magic. Fairy tales are magical stories. It is correct to say that fairy tale is only a fairy tale when there is at least some magic there. Number 3. Fairy tales often feature royalty. When the attention is paid to the characters of many fairy tales, it is obvious they are kings, queens, princes or princesses, or else they are counts or sultans. Number 4. Fairy tales champion the little guy. Often, a fairy tale is on the side of the losers, the little one that nobody sees or cares about. Cinderella is the best example here, and she was neglected and ill-treated by her stepmother and stepsisters. Number 5. Fairy tales are often rags to riches stories. Fairy tales start with poor and sorrowful beginnings and end with rich and happy endings. For examples, fairy tales about the poor girl ends up marrying the prince or king. Or else, a fairy tale about a simple guy ends up a king. The ugly duckling becomes a beautiful swan. Number 6. It is clear in fairy tales who's good and who's evil. In the real world, characters we encounter are a mixture of both good and bad. So, automatically they become very complicated characters. But in fairy tales, characters are either good or evil. Number 7. Fairy tales feature so-called flat characters. When talking further about the characters in fairy tales, it is obvious that they are flat characters. In other words, characters do not experience much development. They have no complex personalities. Bad stepmother remains bad till the end. The king is looking for love throughout the story. Number 8. Fairy tales are fast-paced stories. Fairy tales originated in the oral tradition. When people told these tales, they would add more to the story when they noticed that audience was captivated. Hence, every telling was different. Recording of fairy tales. Until romantics began to collect fairy tales together and write them down, fairy tales were handed down orally until the 18th century. Brothers Grimm, Jacob, and Wilhelm are the best known recorders of European fairy tales. Hans Christian Andersen is considered the father of modern fairy tales. We have reached the end of today's presentation. I hope that you got a clear understanding about fairy tales. And I hope to see you soon with another educational video like this. Thank you very much.